The shipping container manifests listed agricultural equipment and textile machinery, standard cargo moving through established international trade routes, proper documentation, legitimate customs declarations, bills of lading showing authorized importers with verified business licenses and tax identification numbers. Nothing in the paperwork suggested anything unusual about containers departing Southeast Asian ports, bound for industrial facilities across North America and Europe, except thermal imaging from port security drones had detected heat signatures inconsistent with declared cargo, temperature patterns indicating biological sources, movement detected inside containers supposedly holding only machinery and equipment, and intelligence analysis had identified that these specific containers were part of a systematic trafficking operation, moving 327 people across 3 continents over 18 months. Forced labor victims destined for agricultural operations, manufacturing facilities, and domestic servitude, where they would work under threat of violence with no compensation and no freedom. Right now, 43 trafficking victims were sealed inside 5 containers aboard cargo vessels in international waters. Adults and children, ages ranging from 16 to 42, packed into spaces designed for freight with minimal ventilation, no sanitation, and no medical care. Journey time from departure to arrival: 16 days. Survival probability decreased with each hour as oxygen levels dropped. Dehydration progressed, and heat stress mounted in containers crossing equatorial waters. Expected arrival at destination ports: 72 hours. Transfer to trafficking network's distribution system: 12 hours after port arrival. Once dispersed to final locations, recovery would become nearly impossible. ATF Trigger had 3 days to identify vessel locations, coordinate international maritime interdiction, extract victims before life-threatening conditions became fatal, and dismantle a trafficking network that had been operating undetected for over 2 years. The investigation began 14 months earlier, when local law enforcement responded to a suspected break-in at an agricultural facility. Officers discovered 3 individuals hiding in equipment storage, 2 women and 1 man, all showing signs of prolonged malnutrition, physical abuse, and psychological trauma. Initial investigation suggested they were undocumented workers fleeing exploitation, but interviews revealed something more systematic and disturbing. The individuals described organized recruitment in their home country, under false promises of legitimate employment, transportation arranged through established networks with professional documentation and travel arrangements, arrival at facilities where passports were immediately confiscated, movement was restricted, and they were forced to work 16-hour days with no payment beyond minimal food and crowded housing. Attempts to leave resulted in physical violence and threats against family members. They had been held for 8 months before escaping during equipment delivery that provided brief opportunity to flee. Federal investigators recognized patterns consistent with human trafficking for forced labor. The facility where victims had been held was one location in what appeared to be a larger network. A TF coordinated with FBI Human Trafficking Task Force, Homeland Security Investigations, and Department of Labor to expand investigation beyond the single facility to identify the complete trafficking infrastructure. Financial investigation of the agricultural facility revealed payments to labor brokers and recruitment agencies in multiple countries. These entities claimed to provide legitimate migrant worker placement services, but analysis of their operations showed systematic fraud. Workers were recruited with false promises of wages and working conditions, charged illegal recruitment fees that created debt bondage, and delivered to facilities that operated as forced labor operations through threat, coercion, and physical constraint. The recruitment agencies operated through sophisticated deception. Online advertisements and local recruiters in distressed regions offered attractive employment opportunities with good wages, accommodations, documentation assistance, and transportation. Victims paid recruitment fees from $5,000 to $15,000 funds creating immediate debt servitude through predatory interest rates. Once recruited, victims were moved through established trafficking routes. Initial transportation appeared legitimate. Commercial flights with proper documentation, group travel with coordinated itineraries, arrival at destinations where transportation awaited. But upon arrival, the situation transformed. Passports confiscated for processing, transportation to remote facilities, immediate work assignments under threat of deportation or violence, and demands for debt repayment through labor at wages far below promised rates, or often no wages at all. Surveillance of the facility where the 3 victims had escaped revealed ongoing operations. New workers arrived monthly, delivered by transportation companies connected to the recruitment agencies. Workers were housed in converted agricultural buildings with restricted access, monitored movements, and no contact with outside communities. Physical security measures prevented unauthorized departures. Financial analysis showed the facility paid minimal operational costs for labor despite employing 73 workers. Profits were routed to corporate entities in tax havens, suggesting systematic exploitation across multiple operations. But the facility was not isolated. Financial flows from the recruitment agencies revealed payments to 19 different agricultural and manufacturing operations across 6 states. Each facility showed similar characteristics: remote locations, restricted access, minimal labor costs, despite significant workforce numbers, and connections to the same network of recruiters and labor brokers. The investigation had identified not a single trafficking operation, but an organized network systematically moving victims across international borders to multiple exploitation sites. Intelligence fusion with international law enforcement revealed recruitment operations in 4 Southeast Asian nations, 2 African countries, and 3 Eastern European regions. Victims from rural communities with limited opportunities were promised employment, with wages supporting families. Professional marketing materials and fabricated testimonials lured victims into trafficking pipelines. Victim interviews from the escaped individuals and additional witnesses identified at other facilities revealed transportation methods. Initial movement used commercial aviation, with temporary work visas obtained through fraudulent applications. But subsequent investigation revealed a more concerning pattern. Not all victims entered through standard immigration channels. Some had no immigration records at all, suggesting clandestine entry through smuggling operations coordinated by the trafficking network. Customs and Border Protection analysis identified the mechanism: cargo containers modified with concealed compartments, ventilation systems adequate for short-term human occupancy, and false cargo documentation. Victims were transported in these containers as commercial freight, bypassing immigration inspection and creating no official record of their presence in destination countries. The containers moved through legitimate shipping networks, appearing as standard commercial cargo while secretly transporting human beings in conditions designed to evade detection. Thermal imaging review of historical port security footage revealed the pattern. Containers flagged for unusual heat signatures during routine scanning, but investigations were often inconclusive, because by the time physical inspection could be arranged, containers had moved to inland destinations. Cross-referencing these flagged containers against known trafficking network operations identified systematic patterns: specific shipping companies, specific port departure locations, specific destination facilities matching locations where forced labor operations had been identified. But the most alarming discovery came from projecting the trafficking volume. Over 18 months, thermal imaging had flagged 63 containers showing indicators consistent with human occupancy. Not all were confirmed as trafficking operations, but correlation with known network activity suggested at least 40 containers had transported victims. Average capacity estimated at 8 to 12 individuals per container. Total victims trafficked through maritime smuggling: 300 to 500 people, with 327 specifically identified through investigation records and victim interviews. Current intelligence indicated active shipping operations. 5 containers currently at sea departed from Southeast Asian ports 6 days earlier. Expected arrival at North American and European ports within 72 hours. Thermal imaging from port of departure showed heat signatures consistent with human occupancy. Shipping manifests listed agricultural equipment, matching false documentation patterns identified in previous trafficking operations. Destination addresses included facilities already under investigation for forced labor practices. Vessel tracking confirmed container locations aboard cargo ships in international waters. 3 containers aboard a vessel bound for a West Coast port. 2 containers aboard a vessel heading to a European port. Both vessels operating on schedule for arrival within 3 days. Maritime analysis indicated containers would be transferred to inland transportation within 12 hours of port arrival, distributed to final destination facilities within 24 hours of unloading. Once dispersed inland, victim recovery would require identifying specific facility locations, obtaining warrants, coordinating multi-jurisdictional operations, and executing raids, a process requiring weeks while victims remained in exploitation situations. Medical assessment of container conditions created urgent timeline pressures. 16-day journey created life-threatening risks. Oxygen depletion causing hypoxia after week 1, severe dehydration within 10 days, heat stress potentially fatal without ventilation. Victims at sea 6 days faced declining survival probability after day 12. Containers required interception before medical conditions became fatal. Federal coordination expanded to international maritime authorities. ATF coordinated with FBI, Homeland Security investigations, U.S. and Coast Guard, and international law enforcement in nations with jurisdiction over the vessels and ports. Legal authorities were established for maritime interdiction of vessels suspected of human trafficking. Warrants were prepared for container seizure, vessel boarding, and arrest of shipping company personnel facilitating trafficking operations. Medical teams were positioned for emergency response. Container opening required specialized equipment to ensure safe extraction without causing harm to weakened victims. Medical personnel with tropical disease expertise, dehydration treatment capabilities, and trauma counseling prepared for immediate intervention upon victim extraction. International coordination ensured medical teams would be available at both interdiction locations, regardless of which vessels were boarded first. Intelligence gathering intensified around destination facilities. All 19 agricultural and manufacturing operations connected to the trafficking network were placed under surveillance. Additional facilities identified through financial analysis brought total surveillance targets to 27 locations across 6 states. The investigation would not simply rescue victims currently in transit, it would dismantle the entire forced labor network simultaneously to prevent reorganization and continued exploitation of victims already at facilities. 60 hours before the first vessel's scheduled port arrival, international maritime authorities executed coordinated interdictions. U.S. Coast Guard intercepted the West Coast-bound vessel in international waters. European maritime law enforcement boarded the Europe-bound vessel in cooperation with flag state authorities. Boarding teams located the 5 containers identified in intelligence analysis, secured the vessels to prevent interference, and prepared for container opening operations. Container extraction required careful procedure. Thermal imaging confirmed human presence inside. Audio detection identified voices calling for help. Medical teams assessed that immediate opening was necessary. Victims had been confined for 13 days, approaching critical medical risk thresholds. Specialized equipment opened containers while maintaining structural integrity to prevent collapse that could injure occupants. All 43 trafficking victims were extracted alive. Ages ranged from 16 to 42, consisting of 27 adults and 16 minors. Medical assessment revealed severe dehydration in 38 individuals, malnutrition in all victims, respiratory complications from prolonged exposure to limited oxygen, and physical injuries consistent with abuse during boarding and confinement. All victims required immediate medical intervention. 4 individuals needed intensive care for life-threatening dehydration and heat exposure. Medical teams provided treatment aboard rescue vessels before transferring victims to hospitals at nearest ports. Victim interviews revealed trafficking process: recruitment in home countries with false employment promises, payment of recruitment fees creating debt bondage, transportation to ports where they were loaded into containers with minimal supplies, 16-day journey in confined conditions with inadequate ventilation and no sanitation. They were told they would work to repay recruitment debts and earn wages, but upon planned arrival, they would be transferred to facilities where their passports would be confiscated, and they would be forced to work under threat of violence with no freedom of movement. Simultaneous with maritime interdictions, federal law enforcement executed coordinated operations against the trafficking network's ground infrastructure. All 27 facilities under surveillance were raided simultaneously at 0500 hours. Entry teams recovered 218 additional trafficking victims held in forced labor conditions. Total victim recovery: 261 individuals across all operations. Not one victim remained in trafficking network control. Arrests totaled 96 individuals across all locations. Facility operators who held victims in forced labor conditions, transportation coordinators who moved victims from ports to facilities, recruitment agency operators who lured victims with false promises, shipping company personnel who facilitated container trafficking, financial operators who laundered profits through offshore accounts, and network leadership who coordinated the entire operation across multiple countries. Financial investigation revealed the network's profits. Over 18 months, forced labor operations had generated $17.4 million in value through unpaid labor. Victims worked in agriculture harvesting crops, in manufacturing facilities producing goods, in domestic service providing household labor, all positions where they received no compensation or minimal payments far below minimum wage, while profits flowed to network operators. Asset forfeiture operations seized $11.2 million in network accounts. Properties used for victim housing and exploitation, and equipment used in trafficking operations. Victim services provided comprehensive support. All recovered individuals received medical care, protective housing, immigration relief through T-visa processes, legal representation, and trauma counseling. International coordination enabled family reunification or immigration status for those wishing to remain. Prosecution efforts extended across multiple jurisdictions. Federal charges included human trafficking, forced labor, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Network leadership received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. Facility operators received 15 to 30 years. Recruitment agency operators and transportation coordinators received 10 to 20 years. International cooperation enabled prosecution of overseas recruiters and coordinators in their home countries, producing additional convictions across 4 nations. The investigation's findings revealed the trafficking network's complete scope. Over 18 months, 327 victims had been trafficked. Maritime container smuggling transported approximately 240 individuals. Fraudulent visa processes brought approximately 87 additional victims. The network operated 27 exploitation facilities across 6 states, with international recruitment operations in 7 countries. Total value of forced labor extracted from victims exceeded $17 million, while victims received either no compensation or amounts totaling less than 3% of the value they generated. Prevention analysis quantified what the interdiction achieved. 43 individuals extracted from containers before arrival at facilities where they would have been held in forced labor indefinitely. 218 individuals recovered from existing exploitation situations where they had been held between 4 months and 3 years. 27 facilities shut down permanently. preventing continued exploitation of current victims and trafficking of additional victims to replace those who escaped or became too ill to work. Medical assessment indicated the life-threatening nature of the maritime interdiction timing. 4 victims extracted from containers required intensive care for conditions that would have been fatal within 48 hours without intervention. Dehydration had progressed to levels causing organ stress. Exposure had created dangerous core temperature elevations, and oxygen deprivation had caused respiratory distress. If the vessels had reached port on schedule, if containers had been unloaded and transported inland before opening, these 4 individuals would have died before receiving medical care. The timing of interdiction, 60 hours before scheduled arrival, provided the margin necessary for survival. The remaining 39 victims, while not immediately critical, faced progressive deterioration. Medical projections indicated 8 to 12 would develop life-threatening conditions by arrival, and all would require hospitalization versus the outpatient treatment many received through timely interdiction. The 218 victims recovered from facilities faced indefinite exploitation. Interview data revealed retention through constant surveillance, violence threats against families, debt bondage claims, and isolation preventing help-seeking. Without intervention, these individuals would remain in forced labor for years, while families believed they worked legitimate employment. The trafficking network's infrastructure enabled systematic exploitation at industrial scale. Professional recruitment operations that targeted vulnerable populations, sophisticated transportation logistics that moved victims across international borders while evading detection, multiple exploitation facilities that maximized profit through forced labor, and financial systems that laundered proceeds through legitimate business structures. The network operated with efficiency and organization equivalent to legitimate international businesses, except their product was human exploitation, and their profit came from modern slavery. None of this continued after ATF Trigger's interdiction. The maritime smuggling routes were disrupted, and shipping companies involved faced permanent scrutiny, preventing resumed trafficking operations. The recruitment agencies were shut down and operators prosecuted, eliminating the source of new victims. The exploitation facilities were raided and closed, ending the forced labor that generated profits. The financial networks were exposed and assets seized, eliminating the resources needed to rebuild operations. Communities where victims worked never knew forced labor operated nearby. Workers they might have seen, products they purchased, were generated through trafficking hidden behind legitimate business operations, employing victims in plain sight. The investigation, that began with 3 escaped victims, expanded through 14 months of intelligence gathering, financial analysis, international coordination, and surveillance operations that mapped the complete trafficking network infrastructure. The operation that rescued 43 victims from containers and 218 from facilities required coordination across federal agencies, international law enforcement, maritime authorities, medical teams, and victim services organizations. Federal law enforcement prevented 43 individuals from entering forced labor servitude, extracted 218 individuals from ongoing exploitation, prosecuted 96 traffickers across the network's organizational structure, seized $11.2 million in criminal proceeds, shut down 27 exploitation facilities, and dismantled international recruitment and transportation systems that had trafficked over 300 individuals across 3 continents. The containers were at sea, the victims sealed inside, the schedule set for arrival and distribution. Medical conditions were deteriorating toward fatal levels. Facility operations continued exploiting existing victims while preparing to receive new arrivals. The network operated with confidence born of 18 months of successful trafficking without significant law enforcement interference. Authorization for continued operations was implicit in the ongoing shipments and facility preparations. ATF Trigger's interdiction occurred 60 hours before scheduled arrival. Not one container reached port intact, with victims inside. Not one trafficking victim entered forced labor. Not one exploitation facility continued operating. The network that had trafficked 327 people over 18 months was completely dismantled in coordinated operations that rescued every identified victim and prosecuted every identified trafficker. The timeline, the coordination, the intelligence fusion across multiple agencies and nations prevented human beings from being bought, sold, transported, and exploited like commercial cargo. The investigation ensured that people who had been promised better lives received actual freedom instead of modern slavery. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by federal human trafficking interdiction concepts. It does not depict any real operation, individuals, or specific cases. All scenarios, numbers, and details are created for illustrative purposes to demonstrate the investigative methods and coordination used in major trafficking prevention operations.